Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Danny Evans Ingram, also known as Zaz, also known as Zazu. And tonight we have Andy Reeve in conversation with Sam Gilbert. If you are here because you are interested in data, then you are in for a treat. I know that Andy loves kind of open data, and Sam's book Good Data explores the explosion of information and how that can change our world for the better. So before I hand over to Andy to host the conversation, I just want to tell you a little bit about Beyond Books and what that is and what that means for this conversation too. So Beyond Books is a place where we acknowledge and treasure all the spaces for reading, sharing and discussing what books are and have been to us. Beyond Books brings voices that offer a wide range of opinions and experiences. Beyond Books is also a platform where we use books as a medium to break down complex ideas. We are passionate about investing into what those ideas can be by strengthening and reimagining our existing infrastructure, as well as thinking further into the many possibilities that books themselves present for us. So this event with Sam, we hope, is one of those events where you leave the evening with like questions, as well as having some of those questions already answered. So much of our lives are so digital now. And is it possible to have good data? And that's a question we hope Sam and Andy will be getting into. So please feel free to post any questions in the chat, and do remember to get yourself a copy of Good Data. If your local library doesn't have a copy, worry not. And we are partnered up with Samantha Williams from This Is Book Love, and you can order via a link, and we'll share that in the chat. Samantha has also offered attendees a small discount, so please do use Book Love, the front room, to make use of that, and I will post that link for you. So before we start the conversation, I just want to give you a little bit of an introduction to who Andy and Sam are. So we'll start with Andy Reeve. So since leaving school, Andy has been on a 15-year applied politics, philosophy and economics course, starting with studying money banking and finance at a time when professors were amazed with collateralized debt orders before they broke the financial system and helped lead us into a significant recession. From here, Andy entered the murky world of advertising, using philosophy, psychology research, and data to understand how to influence people's purchasing decisions, all in the name of client return on investment, including helping to launch several websites, digital campaigns, and social media presences back when they were called new media. What a throwback. After this stint in the commercial world, Andy was intrigued with how he could use his time to have a positive impact on the city. He arrived in the public sector just as the word austerity was being used and budgets were being slashed. Despite this, he worked up to become a senior intelligence analyst within the West Midlands Police, analysing large, complex data sets to guide operational activity and identifying strategic priorities for the organisation. The politics and power structures of this type of organisation helped to guide his understanding on relationships and collaboration further. So next we go on to Sam Gilbert. Sam Gilbert is an affiliated researcher at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, an expert in data-driven marketing. He was employee number 1 and chief marketing officer at Bought by Many, an award-winning fintech startup named as one of the hottest startups in Europe. I don't know why I did an American accent there, but it felt right. And ranked in the Sunday Times as TechTrack's 100 list of the UK's fastest growing companies. Previously, Sam Gilbert was head of strategy and development at the data company Experia and head of consumer finance at Santander. He lives in Copenhagen, and Good Data is Sam's first book. So I will pass over to Andy Reeve if you'd like to come on screen, and I will see you all at the end in the outro. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny, and welcome, Sam, to tonight's talk. We'll be talking about Good Data, standard show the book. It does exist. So yeah, thanks for joining us tonight, Sam. If you could just give us kind of a brief introduction to the book and the kind of main themes that you cover in it, and we'll have a little conversation after that. And then if anybody's got any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat function in the side here, and we'll pick those up probably just after the Q&A. So yeah, over to you, Sam.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks also to Danny for that very generous introduction. So the reason that I wrote the book Good Data was because I felt that people were ready to hear a different and more optimistic story about data and digital technology. And I guess the book is really animated by three big ideas that probably seem a little bit contrarian at first sight. So the first of those ideas is that surveillance capitalism theory, which is the frame through which most questions of data and technology are discussed at the moment, is wrong. The second big idea is that actually, if we put more of our data into the public domain, and if we think of our data not as our private property, but as a common shared resource that everybody contributes to and everybody can benefit from, we can actually unlock a lot of social and public benefits that are at the moment maybe in danger of getting lost because people generally see things through the lens of surveillance capitalism. And then the third thing that I really wanted to do with the book was offer a different perspective on what power means in the digital age. So I think most of the time when we think about the power of digital technology companies now, we think about power being concentrated in the hands of a small number of private actors. But actually, what I argue in the book is that the most distinctive thing about digital power is that it's very distributed. And that's both the thing that is wonderful and empowering about it, but also the thing that is can be a threat to our public discourse and to our politics and so on. And so I'm aware that probably all of that, as an overview, sounds a bit serious, but I also, I guess, wanted to highlight that Good Data is also kind of a memoir. So I try to bring these questions to life, not just with kind of academic argument, but also with a lot of funny stories from my experiences of trying to grow a startup. And so I hope that also makes it like a fun book to read.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I particularly personally enjoyed the story about the coffee machine and an investor falling through the floor of one of your offices. I think that's a nice little anecdote, which we might come back to later. Thank you for that kind of introduction into it. And just to kind of set the scene for things, for people who probably aren't aware of the kind of term surveillance capitalism, what to you does that kind of represent, and why do you feel that it was important to introduce a different view to that?
Sure. So surveillance capitalism is a term that was coined by the Harvard Business School professor Shoshana Zuboff in about 2015. And then in 2019, she published a very long book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism that really develops the theory. And I guess what it says is that all of the problems that we associate with the use of data and with digital technology can be traced back to the business model of companies like Facebook and Google, and specifically to the way in which they gather data from individuals who use their products and then apply that data in a way that enables advertisers to target them. So surveillance capitalism kind of argues that that's where everything goes wrong when it comes to digital technology. It goes wrong because there's something fundamentally illegitimate about this process of extracting data from people, and that's a kind of violation of privacy and a violation of individuals' rights over their data. But then it also says that this leads to awful social consequences because it creates incentives for Facebook or for Google to expand their businesses in a way that enables them to hoover up more and more of this data. So when people who believe in surveillance capitalism theory think about very problematic social or political outcomes, like, say, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, or like the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya in Myanmar, they will tend to attribute those outcomes to the business model of what they call surveillance capitalism.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think there's a little bit in the book when you were talking about how it's not necessarily the tools, or sort of seeing Facebook and Google as tools in that respect, and how there's a lack of control over those tools rather than the tools themselves that are leading to these particular issues. What do you think is kind of missing from that, maybe from a regulatory point of view, that helps to bring in those controls that are needed if people like Facebook and Google aren't willing to maybe change their own technology, or to stamp out things which other people might say is socially leads to problems in society. So what do you think regulators could be doing a bit more, or rather than sort of leaving things up to the tech platforms themselves to kind of regulate themselves?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. I mean, it also touches on like another really important part of the surveillance capitalism argument, which basically says that there's something morally wrong with using data to target people. And the argument that I make in the book is that actually I don't think that's quite right. And I talk about the history of targeting, which actually goes back to the 1980s and to the era of the catalogs that you used to be able to kind of get through the mail and then order product from. And at that time in the 80s, it was really hard for marketers to know who they should send catalogs to. It was also a really expensive thing to do. And as a result of that, this technique called geodemographics was invented to help them prioritize which postcodes they ought to send the catalogs to. And the way that geodemographics worked was by running surveys and getting data from the electoral roll and putting that together in order that marketers could then make inferences about what sort of people lived in particular postcodes. So it might be that suburban or postcodes that had a lot of suburban housing a long way from public transport with parking for cars, and those postcodes looked like much better prospects for selling car seats for children than postcodes which are in inner city neighborhoods where buildings have been converted into studio flats, for example. So that's the kind of the history of targeted advertising. And really what's happened with platforms like Facebook is they have brought those kind of techniques up to date for the era of big data and machine learning. So if we kind of think back to the pre-digital age, people didn't tend to think that targeting advertising in that way was morally problematic. And the reasons for that, I think, were that there were only a relatively small number of organizations that were able to do it. And there were also multiple intermediaries that those organizations needed to work with if they wanted to use the geodemographic targeting techniques. So it was very difficult, or it would have been very difficult at that point if you'd wanted to put out a marketing campaign that was very politically divisive or made claims that weren't true, because you would have needed a direct marketing agency to agree to set up that campaign for you. You'd have needed a printer to print your marketing material, and you'd have needed a mailing house to actually distribute that material for you. So there were kind of multiple checks on the ability of people to misuse targeting. So to kind of bring it back to Facebook and to Google and to other digital advertising platforms, the problem that as I see it, is not that there's something inherently morally wrong about targeting. It's just that those platforms have made that targeting capability so widely available. So basically anybody who's listening tonight who is a Facebook user, for example, can log onto Facebook and start targeting ads. All you really need is a credit card and $1, and you're good to go. So from my perspective, that's the circumstances in which ads can be used in problematic ways, because the approval mechanisms for ads and for advertisers are so weak. So what that means is techniques that in previous years would have been used to market trainers or sofas or package holidays can now be used by political parties who have got non-mainstream opinions to target and recruit new supporters. And there's really very little done by the tech companies to control the ways in which that is happening. So I definitely think that the tech companies ought to do more in terms of putting controls in. And I also definitely think in the context of political advertising and advertising about social issues, that's a good area for regulators to look at.
So do you think there is likely to be an incentive to those platforms to kind of make people spend money on their platforms more difficult? Or do you think there's that kind of as the argument from surveillance capitalism goes, is that because their business model is based upon that, they're unlikely to want to change it? So do you think there's a kind of, is there a middle way between those two things?
Yes, so I guess my perspective on this is that because we all spend so much time on these platforms and so much time on the internet in general, a very significant proportion of all the advertising space that is available is controlled by companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter. And there are plenty of advertisers who want to fill up this inventory in order to promote their products and services. So I'm not really sure that in terms of revenue and in terms of the ability for those companies to monetize all of that advertising space that they control, that it's really a massive problem for them to put more checks and controls in place. If we think about the biggest advertisers on these platforms, so on Facebook, the biggest advertisers are companies like Disney and Walmart and financial services companies. So these are companies that can kind of absorb the costs of, or the higher costs of compliance. And I think sometimes when people who are arguing in favor of, or people who buy into surveillance capitalism theory want to criticize advertising as a business model, they imagine that a lot of the revenue is coming from people who want to spread QAnon conspiracy theories or market miracle cures for diseases or whatever it may be, but that actually isn't really the case. So I actually think there's not a particularly strong financial disincentive for Facebook and Google to do something about this. So
there's an interesting bit where you talk about tech CEO hubris and the kind of the leadership of tech CEOs. Do you think there's the leadership intent to want to do that? Do you see people like Zuckerberg, and there's quite an interesting part of the book, you talk about Zuckian libertarianism and his kind of view of the world. Do you think Mark Zuckerberg is likely to and well placed to put in those types of changes, or do you think it has to come from an outside source?
Yes, so I think, that's right. I do go into quite a lot of detail about what I understand Mark Zuckerberg's political ideology to be, and actually I don't really think he's a libertarian. I think he's more of a classical liberal, and I think if he's got a kind of fatal flaw, it's that actually he's too sort of positive and optimistic about human nature. So he expects the best from people all the time. So he expects that if his company makes tools that anybody can use to organize, for example, that they'll use those tools in a good way that has integrity and authenticity about it, rather than using those tools to coordinate acts of violence, for example. And similarly, on the advertising side, I think he sort of genuinely believes that he's done a very good thing for smaller businesses and for startups and for local businesses by making these advertiser tools so accessible and so widely available. And therefore he's kind of reluctant, I think, to engage with the ways in which those tools can get misused. I mean, it's probably also worth saying actually that a downside of more regulation is that it will become harder for smaller businesses to use Facebook advertising to develop their businesses, and I do think we should take the economic and social consequences of that seriously as well. I'm just coming back to your question about should we just leave it to Mark Zuckerberg to solve these problems. I think it's too late for that now. He himself, along with some of the other tech CEOs, has sort of signalled his openness to regulation coming from the outside. So I think really the work for policymakers and for all of us is to determine what those regulations ought to be. And I think they, our kind of guiding principle for that really ought to be that we should try and preserve all of the things that are positive and good about social media and digital technology, data and so on, while getting rid of some of these more negative consequences.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's obviously quite a lot of talk about citizens panels and kind of community kind of engagement in policy making and things like that. And it's something that I think Facebook has tried to some extent in the past to kind of get community involvement in their policy writing. Do you think this kind of discussion about digital regulation and data usage is a good place to start using things like citizen assemblies and start testing that kind of model of democracy in a more direct way?
I mean, the short answer is yes, I absolutely do. And as you pointed out there, Facebook actually does have this history of trying to engage its users in policy changes. So back in around, I think maybe from like 2009 to 2012, there was actually a rule whereby Facebook users were consulted on changes to the data use policy and the terms and conditions of Facebook. But the issue with it was that it just required hundreds and hundreds of millions of people to express an opinion. And as a result, it was just completely impractical to expect that many people to vote on what might be some quite kind of technical change to a policy about how Facebook used data. So, and I mean, you could actually go a step further and say that type of example shows some of the general problems with using, I guess, direct democracy or referendum type democracy to deal with these quite kind of complex and nuanced questions. So I am really optimistic about the idea of citizens assemblies, or what's sometimes called digital mini publics, as a way of getting kind of a representative group of users to be able to input constructively into questions of regulation.
Yeah, great. There's something that I'd be interesting to kind of get your view on and sort of expand out a bit more is this kind of development this week with Apple versus Facebook, and it touches on some of those issues that you say about sort of small businesses being harmed by the changes. So for those that haven't seen, Apple is introducing a new update to its operating software, which is going to ask people to opt in to certain advertising tracking systems, and each app that wants to activate these kind of trackers has to ask users to opt into it. Facebook isn't particularly happy about this because they think it might restrict people's access to data, and then could harm small businesses who are looking to kind of target their advertising as effectively as possible. But what do you kind of think about these kind of latest developments and the kind of, I guess in the link to your book, there's the talk of legitimacy and purpose for people, and this, on the face of it, looks like it's a good way for people to legitimately say they're happy for their data to be tracked and to contribute to providing better services, if that's what the app user says. What do you kind of see Apple's motivations as good, and is this the right sort of way, or do you think this is kind of creeping off in sort of a world where Apple sets the legislation rather than kind of governments?
Yeah, so it's such an interesting and complicated issue in that Apple has this kind of gatekeeping power via its control of the App Store. So on the one hand, you could say that Apple, it shouldn't be for Apple to decide these things, and the only reason they get to decide is because they control the ability of developers to distribute their apps via the App Store. So that's one interesting dimension of it. I think another interesting dimension is the power of the default option. So many years of psychology research in other fields have shown that what you set as the default ends up determining what happens. So in the case of auto-enrollment for pensions, as Cass Sustein and Richard Thaler wrote about in their book Nudge, if you opt people into enrolling for their pensions, many more people enroll. If you opt them out by default, barely anyone enrolls at all. And the reason for this is simply that it's a lot of kind of cognitive load to actively engage with a decision about whether you want to enroll in your company pension. It's a lot of cognitive load to engage in a decision about whether it's going to be overall in your interests to share data with app developers or not. So people will tend to just select the default. And as a result, I think everybody expects that at least 80% of users of iPhones and iPads are going to be opted out of targeted advertising. So what are the problems with that? I think we've touched on some of them already. If you believe, as I do, that there is some sort of social and public value to advertisers being able to run targeted ads, then you probably think that's not a great thing, just because it means organizations won't be able to spend their marketing budgets as efficiently, and smaller businesses that are trying to get started or build a customer base will find it harder to connect with the customers who might be interested in their products and services. So that's, I guess, the more obvious consequence, that advertisers and Facebook are obviously it's in their own interests to be concerned about that. But there are maybe some other things that are not quite so obvious at first sight about why advertising is a really good business model for the internet in general. So one of the things that I value about advertising, and that I talk about a bit in the book, is that it effectively acts as a kind of mechanism of global wealth redistribution, right? So the reason for that is that it funds the provision of universal free services like search and social networking and messaging to everybody, regardless of where they are in the world, what device they've got. As long as they've got an internet connection, they're able to access these services. And just to comment on how that sort of plays out in terms of the financial value of it, if you look at Facebook's financial results for the year 2018, and you look at how much money was earned from a user in North America or in Europe, you'll find that's about $110 a year. If you look at how much was earned from users in the rest of the world region, which is places like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, you'll find that is only around $8 a year. So what that adds up to is effectively Facebook ads redistributing $25 billion worth of value from affluent users in the global north to poorer users in the global south. And if we kind of continue down the path of moving the business model of the internet away from advertising and more towards making people pay for services, I guess I'm a little concerned that that will be to the detriment of users in the global south.
Yeah, that's an interesting point in the book that I was going to touch on. So thank you for bringing that up. It kind of, I think, overlaps for me along something else you talk about, being a good digital citizen and kind of allowing your data to be kind of added to the pool of shared resources which developers and researchers and academics and policymakers are able to access. And just around that kind of point around redistribution, do you think and I think this ties into some of the legitimacy questions, is do you think the companies like Facebook and to some extent Apple as well are involved in this? Are they being good citizens themselves in the way that they approach, well, the traditional means of redistribution in terms of taxation and things like that? How do obviously they make pretty large profits and don't seem to pay much tax in many countries. Do you think those two issues overlap?
Right, so are they being good digital citizens in terms of paying their taxes? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I think there's other aspects in which there's plenty of scope for them to be better digital citizens, including, I think, in putting more of their data into the public domain. So one of the unfortunate consequences of all of the focus that has been put on individuals' privacy is that, kind of like out of their own interests, these companies have started limiting access for researchers to their APIs, which enable researchers to access data and look into important questions. For example, whether the use of digital technology and devices is bad for people's mental health. So yeah, I mean, I completely agree. There's plenty of scope for the big tech companies to be better digital citizens.
And can you just expand a bit more on what on sort of for individuals as being good digital citizens? How do you sort of see that playing out, and how do we encourage more of that if that's what we need to kind of get better policy? And you kind of talk in the book about how that data has helped with kind of COVID-19 restrictions and things like that. How do we encourage people to be better data citizens, perhaps when at the moment this kind of conversation is couched among what could be seen as not very good data citizens in the conglomerates? Yes, absolutely. So I think maybe the first thing that I kind of try and encourage people to do in the book is let go of the idea that our individual data is particularly valuable, like either economically or just to us, because actually the value of data only really comes to life when it's aggregated and put together in very large quantities. So one type of data that I'm particularly interested in and passionate about is Google search data. So we all, by using Google and other search engines every day, generate this enormous volume of data through our Google searches. It doesn't really cost us anything to allow those searches to be aggregated and anonymized and then used by other organizations to either to develop new products and services if we're in the commercial space, or if we're in the kind of the academic or the public health space. This data can also be really, really powerful in terms of revealing things like how infectious diseases are spreading. So I write in part of the book about some of the academics who've done this research. They've been able to do things like look at aggregated searches for particular symptoms and then use that as a kind of early warning system so that they can see where Zika or Ebola or West Nile virus, or most recently COVID-19, is occurring. So that can only happen based on people's willingness to allow their search data to be put into the public domain and then analysed in that way that is kind of in all of our collective interests, even if it doesn't serve our immediate individual interests. And maybe one other example that's worth touching on there is from some work being done by the Opportunity Insights group at Harvard University in America. So this is led by an economist called Raj Chetty. And what he did was managed to put together a data set of anonymized tax records for Americans over a period of many years. And by doing that, he and his team have been able to kind of objectively prove
that the American dream of social mobility is fading, because they're able to look at where people were when they were born and the income of their parents and what sort of family background they came from, and then trace them all the way through to what they're earning now. And that really highlights some of the very stark forms of inequality that exist in the United States. And it simply wouldn't be possible to do that type of analysis if we were too concerned about privacy, and if we said we must not allow data that's as sensitive as our tax records data or our health data to be pooled and analysed in that way.
And with that, so I guess I think what's quite interesting, I'm quite a fan of open data and that kind of those sort of principles of kind of sort of governments sharing as much as possible and as relevant as possible, I suppose, with people. And do you think there's just this sort of broader the data conversation, for want of a better term, in terms of is framed in that kind of asset version of data having an intrinsic value, and do you think to some extent that's been, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, been guided by this notion of data being the new oil type thing, and because oil is a kind of extractive asset, people assume that there's something extractive and kind of dangerous about data in that way? Do you think there's any kind of anything that overlaps on those?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and I think it really highlights the extent to which the language that we choose to talk about abstract concepts like data really matters. So if you talk about it as an asset, you can't help but think of it as property or compare it to other natural resources that you might consider to be assets. And you can't help thinking about these ideas of extraction or expropriation. And maybe in some there's some dimensions of that can be helpful. So although I don't really care for the data as the new oil metaphor, one thing that I do think it's helpful for is reminding us that data processing does have a carbon footprint. And so it just as burning oil does. But some of the ways I think that thinking leads us astray is that it encourages us to imagine that data is a kind of precious resource that's very scarce, when in fact data is a superabundant resource that we're constantly proliferating. And it kind of encourages us also to think that data is like a valuable commodity that somebody is sort of extracting value from our expense. But which actually, as we've already touched on a bit, is not really the reality of how these companies make money. But then perhaps also most importantly, it probably subconsciously makes us think that data, like it can only be used once. It, like somebody asserts monopoly type control over data, and once they've got it, that's it. And of course that isn't in the nature of data at all. Data is what economists call non-rival. So that means it can be used again and again and again by multiple people ad infinitum. You can copy it and it doesn't lose its usefulness. So I think changing the way that we think about data and the language we use to describe it helps us imagine these different possibilities like open data, which you just alluded to.
Yeah, and I think that kind of language thing is quite interesting in terms of you kind of move on to talk about how data is more like the lifeblood of the digital world, and in a kind of context for me, that kind of the lifeblood is something which is kind of regenerative in nature, and it helps to supply nutrients from one part of a system into another part of the system. What do you think are the kind of major hurdles to get people to move away from those two different frames of mind? Is it possible to undo some of that kind of data as the next oil metaphor and start to kind of bring people along on that journey of we can all contribute to a stronger future by having a kind of more collective view of data rather than seeing it as individual private property?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope it's possible. And as I said earlier, I guess one of the key motivations for me in like writing the book was to try and start a different sort of conversation about what data can mean and be for all of us if we think about it as a collective shared resource or as a commons rather than as property. And I guess the other things that would really help would be if there was more general awareness of movements like open data, and if we talked more about the ways in which data openness is already enabling services that people find really useful. So I don't suppose that many people who use Citymapper, which is a fantastic public transport app, appreciate that it couldn't exist without open transport data being made available by public sector organisations for third-party developers to build apps off. I think people probably just use it and think it's great and don't understand that that's the fundamental backbone of that is a willingness of organisations to share data for the greater good. So maybe it would be good if we heard more of those stories as well.
Okay, so and going on to the sort of more optimistic end of the world, you often talk in the book about the world of stores and the kind of the story of their development from parrot cages to a multi-million-pound business. Can you just sort of enlighten on that a bit more and kind of tell the story of that and show how valuable open data was in that respect to create new economic opportunities?
Yes, sure. So this comes back to my personal favorite type of data, which is Google search data again. So I got very interested in this when I was working at the data company Experian. And I guess that happened through a couple of projects. The first one was with a business called Screwfix, the DIY retailer. And they were kind of using Google data in quite an interesting way to understand better what people searched for when they searched for their products. And they discovered things like the fact that they had listed their product for firing nails into material as a nailer, but actually 10 times as many people, when you looked at search data, called it a nail gun. And so they started calling their products nail guns instead of nailers, and that resulted in a kind of 10x improvement in online sales for that product line. So that's like kind of probably the most banal way in which that data can be useful. And the company just alluded to, World Stores, went a step further, which was to look at a very, very large data set of Google searches about unusual home and garden products that people were searching for. And they essentially, by doing that, were able to set up this enormous network of niche websites called things like Trampoline World and Mattress World, where they listed all of these unusual products. And they also kind of took advantage of things like the fact you can now have a relationship with a drop shipper in India or China and have them manufacture and deliver the product. So they were able to supply all these weird and wonderful home and garden product needs. And then the kind of most fun story that's in this space was actually came from a marketing agency called Forward 3D, which is part of a Forward internet group. And they had been thinking about Google search data, thinking about the ways in which they might analyze it to decide what new business they ought to start. And having sort of locked their data scientists into a bunker for several months, the data scientists kind of came out to present their findings about the best new business that it was possible for Forward Internet Group to start. And the answer turned out to be parrot cages, much to the consternation of the organisation, because obviously that isn't necessarily the first thing you would think of as being a great opportunity to start a new business. But they backed this finding they found a drop shipper in India who could supply parrot cages. They set up a simple website, and within 12 months, they'd sold £3.5 million worth of parrot cages. And actually, that story ended up being the inspiration for me when I co-founded this business, Bought by Many, that we talked about in the introduction. And the purpose of Bought by Many was to serve unusual needs for insurance. And so I kind of repeated the parrot cages experiment, but with data about insurance, and found that the biggest area of unmet demand for insurance was pug insurance. So that's insurance for pug dogs. And that again was quite surprising, but it turned out there were good reasons why pug owners were looking for specific types of insurance for pugs. So pugs at the time were the hottest puppy, as it were, extremely popular with people looking for puppies. And as a result, the price of buying a pug had gone up. But the cover that was available from insurers for theft and loss of a pug hadn't changed at all. So the opportunity was there to kind of tailor an insurance product specifically for pugs. And what we then found was that there was also loads of unmet demand in this search database for insurance for all kinds of other different breeds of dog, from cockapoos to German shepherds to giant schnauzers. And the end result of this was that Bought by Many has become the fastest growing pet insurance company in Europe. So I guess that kind of helps bring to life in a commercial context how powerful analysing this type of data can be.
Cool. I've got one last question, and then we'll go to a few questions that we've got coming in from the audience. My last question is, what are you most excited about in the realms of data and technology as we move forward over the next 10 years or so?
So such a good question. I mean, I guess it's probably just going to come back to many of the themes we've already covered. So, like, I guess I'm excited about academic researchers, particularly in the social sciences, so disciplines like economics, sociology, political science, and using some of these data analysis techniques that currently mostly exist in the commercial world. Because I just think there's hugely exciting potential if researchers apply these techniques to things that we collectively need to know about. Similarly, I'm also really excited about the opportunity for policymakers and civil servants and people who work in the public sector to do things like analyze search data in order to understand what the unmet needs of the citizens that they're trying to serve are better. So I guess that's probably it. That's my hope for the next few years.
Wonderful. Sounds good. Okay, we're going to go over to a couple of questions now from the audience, and just picking up on something that Pauline Roche is saying around the importance of better data literacy in the general public. How do you think we can improve people's data literacy across things from that sort of notion of how data is used and created through to how we can kind of maybe just disentangle some of the sort of scare stories, I suppose, and what sort of education and stuff do you think is needed around data literacy?
Yeah, obviously I completely agree. This is like a key thing, and also something that will take a long time to change if we rely on improving it through education. So one of the things that I think is really important is that there's more circulation of people. So I think some of the best ideas happen when you put together people with skills and experience from one domain with other people who come from a completely different context. So really interesting in the context of your own background, Andy, that you've worked in the advertising and marketing world and then applied those skills in the context of crime and policing. So that's a really great example of the sort of cross-fertilization of ideas that I think will generally benefit everyone in terms of data literacy. I guess probably the other thing to just touch on is that at the moment it feels like there's kind of quite a strong orthodoxy around the ideas of surveillance capitalism, and to the point that it almost seems controversial to talk about some of these ideas, talk about the idea that putting more of our data rather than less of our data into the public domain might be a good thing. So it'd be great to see more books being published, more voices being heard from people who are like willing to make a sort of positive case for how data can be used.
Great. And on that, just seeing one from Pauline, which says, what publications about data does Sam find inspiring?
Gosh, so I think there's been some really fantastic work done by organisations like the Open Data Institute. So I wouldn't have the sort of understanding of Citymapper that I articulated earlier on if it wasn't for the fact that the Open Data Institute's committed to putting stories about how open data can be powerful into the public domain. I also think in the academic sphere, there's some really interesting work being published in journals like Big Data and Society that's very thought-provoking if you're more academically minded. I mean, also worth saying, even though I don't always agree with writers like Shoshana Zuboff or Cathy O'Neill, who wrote Weapons of Mass Destruction, or Hannah Fry, who wrote Hello World, and there's so many interesting and inspiring books being published at the moment on topics relating to data and artificial intelligence and digital ethics. There's a lot of stuff to draw on.
Great, thank you. I have one from Imi. She says, can you give some examples of where it's good for targeted ads to work? What's the best possible way of using micro-targeting and that type of advertising?
Sure. So, probably my favourite example of this is a story that was told by a venture capital investor who actually thinks that we would not have had this proliferation of successful startups in the UK if it wasn't for Facebook ads. And the example that this investor gives is of a friend of hers who has a business that does customized cake stands. And so I guess you could kind of describe it as like a maker type business. And in the period before we had micro-targeted advertising, it would have been really hard to grow a business like that by investing money in marketing. But because those technologies now exist, the person who's running this cake stand business is, instead of having to run a focus group or experimentally spend lots of money buying a full page ad in a magazine that she thinks might be her target audience, she can just take the 100 email addresses of the 100 people who've bought her cake stands, upload them to Facebook, and then Facebook will find an audience of people who look similar to the people who already bought the cake stands and enable her then to market the cake stands to those people. So all of a sudden she's got this ready-made audience. So that type of very powerful technology is just hugely beneficial if you've got a micro business or a maker business, or you're a local business and you want to expand your reach.
Great, thank you. And we've got one question from Samantha Williams. This is a nice big one to potentially end on. What does it mean when people say algorithms are racist or data is racist? And are you able to expand on this or recommend any books or experts that mention this research?
Yes, so this is such a great and such an important question. So I'll maybe talk about the books and the experts first. So a couple of them I already alluded to. So I think Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, is fantastic. Hannah Fry's book, Hello World, is also fantastic. There's also a lot of great work by Kate Crawford and Meredith Whittaker. So like all of their writing, I think is really good on what's called algorithmic bias or unfairness. So what do people mean when they say these things about algorithms? I think they're probably commenting on two things. So one is on sort of actual real examples where algorithmic decision making appears to have been detrimental to people based on their race or based on other characteristics that in normal life, in the real world, we would not accept decisions being made on. So I guess that's like the output side of it. Sometimes though, people will also talk about like data being racist, and a lot of the time what they mean by that is that data about a group of people will accurately reflect the racial biases or advantages and disadvantages that exist in a society. So race is sort of in some ways baked into the data. So just to try and bring that to life with a practical example, we might have a motor insurer that prices differently based on postcode, and it might charge higher prices to postcodes that have got higher concentrations of people who have a particular ethnic background in it, and that generally won't be because the car insurer in question has themselves got a kind of a sort of like racist perspective on the risk associated with those drivers. It will be something to do with the fact that so let's say that those postcodes might be areas of higher deprivation, for example, and that might in turn be associated with higher claims for car theft, for example. But what's kind of ethically problematic about it, and what is really important about some of this work that scholars are doing in this area at the moment, is that it highlights how race can be sort of redundantly encoded into data that is used to make decisions. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And I'm gonna be cheeky and ask one final question then from that, because how do we get people to be a bit more sort of open to exploring and questioning data in their own daily lives, rather than sort of receiving it and kind of just sort of without question? So how do you kind of how do you get people to form good data from what they're receiving and start to kind of be more curious and ask better questions of it?
Sure. So I think one of my favorite ways into this is Google Trends. So this is the simple tool that Google makes available that allows you to just go and look at how people's search behavior is changing over time, how it's different in different parts of the world, what Google searches relate to other Google searches. And it's just quite a kind of fun way of engaging with what is otherwise quite a complex data set. And Google also does some nice presentations and videos to bring some of this data to life. So I guess this is a long way around of saying that I think things like interactive visualizations of data are really important for to help people engage with it and find value in it.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you very much for tonight, Sam. I'm just going to hand back to Danny, and they will appear back on the screen any moment now.
Andy,
Like
that was
magic.
really timing. That was great.
Wow,
Wow.
I'm trying my best. Thank you so much for that, Sam. That was really interesting and really thought-provoking. And thank you for joining us tonight. It's been really nice.
Oh, that's my pleasure. Thank you so much for so many great questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel really enlightened about data now. I definitely have lots of like my own thoughts and feelings about it, but I think this conversation really helped kind of tie some of that down, or maybe like get me thinking about different parts of it, which is always good. It's always good to kind of yeah, be challenged. And Andy, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. Sam, thank you so much for being here. I just want to direct everyone to the chat, where there is a link from Booklove, where you can purchase good data, and Booklove have been very generous with us. And if you use the discount code Booklove, the front room, all one word, you will get like a little friendly discount there. So thank you for Booklove for doing that as well. Yeah, I just really appreciate this. We're really excited for this to have happened as part of Beyond Books. And if you want to know anything else about what we're doing around Beyond Books, then please head to thefrontroom.cc and head to our calendar, and all of our most recent events will be there. So thank you so much. And I guess at this point we say goodbye, and thank you to everyone who's been in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.